Greetings, and welcome back to the Rose Bros podcast. This episode, we are joined by Trevor Tombe, Professor of Economics and Research Fellow at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Trevor's academic research mainly explores international trade, macroeconomics, and fiscal federalism. Trevor is also co-director of Finances of the Nation, which aims to assemble Canadian public finance data, analysis, and commentary, and make it available to researchers, journalists, students, and the general public. Trevor holds a PhD and a Master of Arts in Economics from the University of Toronto, and a Bachelor of Business Administration in Finance and Economics from Fraser University. Among other things, we sat down and discussed inflation and the central bank 2% target rate, what healthy interest rates are, and why the Alberta economy is growing. Enjoy. This podcast episode is sponsored by Conate Water Solutions. Do you need cost-effective water sourcing options to supply your next drilling or completions program? Conate Water Solutions is a specialized hydrogeology company focused on water well drilling, testing, and water management services in Western Canada and Texas. Contact info at conatewater.com or check out conatewater.com for more details. This podcast is sponsored by headracingcanada.com. Looking for high-performance ski gear this winter? In partnership with four-time Olympian Manny Osborne Parody, headracingcanada.com is offering the lowest prices possible through its online storefront by passing brick-and-mortar savings on to customers. Check out headracingcanada.com for more info and get your high-performance ski gear for the upcoming season. Well, we're recording now.
Great.
Greetings, Trevor Tombe.
Good to be here and good to meet you.
Good morning. It's very nice to meet you too. Thank you very much for doing this.
Yeah, my pleasure.
We're sitting here in University of Calgary. It's nostalgic to come back and be here. So
that's right. In one of the original buildings, I think, too. So one of the older, less glamorous buildings here in social science. But thanks for making the trip out.
I appreciate your time. Officially, you are a econ prof / writer. You contribute to Global Mail and various publications. But how would you describe yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a professor of economics here at the University of Calgary. I've been for a little bit over a decade now, and also research fellow at the School of Public Policy downtown. So pretty actively involved in, the regular teaching and research activities here, but also very policy oriented, actively engaged in kind of conversations around different policy issues here in the province and Canada nationally. So I guess my main areas of expertise are kind of macroeconomic issues, international trade and public finances as well.
So you studied econ in school?
Yeah, that's right. My undergraduate degree from Simon Fraser was in finance, so bachelor's of business administration there. And then I did my master's and PhD at the University of Toronto in economics.
Why become an econ prof?
That's a great question. Well, economics in general is, I think, just a really fascinating area because it informs so much of, our day-to-day life, the pressures that we face, the trade-offs involved in all the choices that we make. But also, as we're seeing and have seen now for several years, like economic developments affect us all in really substantial ways. And, Canada in particular being exposed to lots of global developments. I think it's very important just as engaged citizens to be aware of these economic issues, what the challenges are that we face, what are some of the policy options to think about how to overcome those challenges. So it's just a super fascinating area, and I've always found that to be the case.
Well, I looked you up on Rate My Prof before we started, and you've got a 5 out of 5 rating. So
okay, that's good to know. No, I do enjoy teaching. I'm confident there are some lower ratings on there somewhere. Maybe you didn't scroll down far enough.
That's an accomplishment. That's hard to do with demanding students. So you are uncommon academic in the sense you have skin in the game. You're willing to take personal risks, step out of the ivory tower, so to speak, put your name on articles, write columns, you have your own website, put your name out there, do stuff like this. Have you thought of it from that perspective and putting skin in the game?
Well, I'm not sure I'd think of it as skin in the game. I mean, academics, when they write papers, put their name attached to it. And often, though, the outlet for a lot of research activities of academics are academic journals. And we're writing for kind of our own peers, if you will, writing to advance the research frontier. And some of us, though, especially all of the faculty involved at the School of Public Policy here downtown, are very much actively engaged in public-facing type of activities, trying to really inform both the conversation, really to help people's understanding of important issues, try and move the needle there, but also help inform governments around what policy options might be, what things to consider, how to design things in the most efficient way possible. And so I think, especially here at the University of Calgary and the School of Public Policy, there's quite a number that do get out there and try and have direct impact, if you will. But I guess you're right that there's some risk of that. I guess I'm pretty active on Twitter, for example, and it's certainly not uncommon to maybe tweet something that you later come to regret. I do try and be pretty careful with what I tweet, but there's some potential reputational risks that you take anytime you're engaged in a public kind of discussion on critical policy issues. But I have fun doing it, and hopefully add some value to the conversation.
Do you think of it in terms of keeping yourself grounded in reality, so to speak, or how do you approach it that way?
Yeah, so my research has always been connected to practical policy challenges. I think, just one example is I have several research papers on interprovincial trade issues in Canada. And this is something where governments have also started to prioritize this, dropping barriers to the movement of goods and services across borders. Beer and wine. We've had that Supreme Court case a couple of years ago about someone having challenges just personally buying beer in Quebec and bringing it back to New Brunswick. And so these are policy issues, certainly in the news, part of the conversation, and being involved in that kind of public debate, I think, does inform how I approach the academic side of things. It certainly also affects what are the topics that I like to dig into. So inflation today is the most topical issue. We're seeing that in the Alberta election campaign, which we're right in the middle of. Affordability is right there at the top of the agenda. And so that naturally sparks interest among myself and other researchers to dive into what some of the factors are leading to inflation getting as high as it has, for example. So a recent paper with my colleague here, Professor Sonia Chen, that's coming out in I think a couple of weeks, tries to unpack that data in a lot more detail. And I don't think if I wasn't involved in kind of public policy conversations that I would have necessarily even thought about doing that as a research topic. So I think, I get benefit from being engaged because it does inform what topics I want to dig into, right? And ideally, that's kind of what academics should be doing in general, right? Researching areas that are critically important for the country, and knowing what's important for lots of people out there is I think part of what can influence what topics you dive into.
Do you get to the top of the academic ladder, which you are?
I wouldn't say that at all. I'm solidly right there in the middle of the ladder. A little bit off the ground, but not too high.
You have to put a lot of time into
for sure.
Theory and study textbooks and whatnot and papers and everything else. Was there a time when you had to reflect on yourself, or maybe when you graduated, when you thought to yourself you need to reconcile kind of the day-to-day realities of outside school with what you learned, or how do you thought of it that way? Or
well, so academics is a profession or an occupation that's, I guess, kind of unique. We have a lot of flexibility in how we manage our time. You're right. It is time consuming to absorb research that others are producing. Lots of reading, no question. Teaching as well, time taken with students, helping supervise graduate students in particular. But it's something where, every moment, most of us just love it. That's why we got into it. So it's even got some consumption value for us, if you will. It's simultaneously a job, but it's also something that we just love to do.
This isn't a political podcast, but if you were to describe your political views, I guess, on this spectrum without a capitalized political party label, how would you describe yourself?
Yeah, I guess I would describe myself as, without getting into like what my ideological preferences are, certainly grounded in practical policy issues. And I think, depending on the electoral cycle that we're in, sometimes we get more attention paid to policy questions than at other times. And I definitely prefer when the political conversation is focused on policy issues than, the kind of other aspects of the political bun fights that we see.
Interest rates. Do we need to go higher? Do we need to stay the same? Do we need to go lower?
So I think that's certainly the most important question facing central banks all around the world today. I think maybe take a step back for a second. Interest rates rose as rapidly as they did because inflation rose as rapidly as it did. It certainly reached highs last summer at a little over 8%, 8.1% peak in June of 2022. 1 year prior to that, it was about 3%. So that jump from 3 to over 8 was the fastest acceleration that we've seen in inflation in Canada since the 1950s. So the situation that central banks faced changed quickly and dramatically. And so they responded last year by here in Canada increasing the policy rate from 0.25 at the start of the year to 4.5 that we're at today. And so that's a big rapid jump. Now, where we go from here, I think that there's a lot of indications that suggest that the worst of the inflation pressure is behind us. We've seen several months now in a row where inflation on a month-to-month basis is coming in line with kind of where we'd like it to be. Probably still on the higher end, but monetary policy, the moves that we've seen, takes time. Typically about 1.5 to 2 years for those interest rates to fully affect consumer decisions, investment decisions, and therefore demand for goods and services, and therefore prices. And so the increases in interest rates that we saw last year, they're still working their way through and will be for the balance of this year and into 2024. So I don't think there's a strong case for the central bank to increase interest rates anymore, just because there's a lot that it's already done that is still working through. And a lot of the big price pressures that we saw last year have already dissipated. So for me, the question is, how long do rates stay at their current level? Like, when do we start decreasing them? And that's something where I think we'll get a lot better sense of in the summer. If recent trends continue, we may very well see the headline rate of inflation in Canada drop below 3% this summer. Potentially June or July, we'll see that. And that, I think, will change the conversation quite a bit. And the bank may start to think about whether or not it wants to decrease rates maybe as early as the fall, potentially before the end of the year, I think is quite likely. And again, the reason is because these interest rate changes take time. The bank needs to think about where Canada's economy will be in 2025 when it's making its rate decisions today. And so because I think, the inflation picture is improving pretty rapidly, and I think likely will continue to improve as we get into the summer, they'll start to be thinking down the road. Now, where will rates settle is another question. So that's, think about it in terms of where does monetary policy need to be if the economy is operating at its potential level of output? So how much we're producing, how much employment do we have at a sustainable level consistent with a on-target 2% inflation rate? That estimates vary, but interest rates of between 2.5% to 3% is what's generally thought of, and what the bank thinks of as a neutral position. So any interest rate above that 3% is contractionary and is going to represent a kind of a drag on aggregate demand, drag on economic growth generally. So I think we'll start to see some gradual reductions later on this year. Those will continue through 2024, and then they'll be settling around that 2.5% to 3% range. I should be clear that I've always been relatively optimistic about inflation over the past little while, just because for 8 straight months, month after month after month, inflation, when you strip out volatile components, food and energy, so core inflation, has been coming in within the target 1% to 3% range. It didn't last month. So, we got some new data just a few days ago, but that slight uptick in inflation from 4.3 to 4.4, that's really just because of oil prices. And they've come down. And so I think once we get this month's data in I guess 3 or 4 weeks from now, we're going to see a big drop in the inflation rate. And so I'm pretty optimistic with where things are. It's just that inflation is a very, very slow moving statistic because it's this year over year comparison. So it takes 12 full months for new developments to show up in that headline statistic fully. I think that was maybe a long answer to your question, but yeah, on interest rates specifically, maybe hold the line for a little bit, but start dropping them in the fall, and get back into that 2.5% to 3% range, next year.
If you were to zoom out a little bit, do you think 2 to 3% inflation is what we should be targeting? Is that a good number to be at?
Yeah, that's a great question because, there's nothing about 2% that itself is necessarily better than, say, a 2.5% target or a 3% target or a 1.5%. 2 is what we chose about 30 years ago to be our inflation target. Now, because we chose that as the target, we've built up a lot of credibility over the years where the central bank was really incredibly successful at achieving that inflation target for a very long time. This episode that we're in right now is basically the only time we have materially deviated from our inflation target. And getting back to it is, I think, important just to solidify confidence in monetary policy. I think it would be incredibly risky for the bank to change its target before, we get back to what that target really is, because then it will undermine their credibility around having any future target. Now, I guess that aside, we have a target because it's something that's jointly determined between the government and the Bank of Canada. And they recently had their mandate renewed last year. And so this is going to stay in place for a 5-year period. So I think that's until 2027. And we should never deviate from that target. As part of the regular review cycle every 5 years, maybe think about what to do and how to do things better. But just because we've built up a lot of, reputational capital, if you will, we got to stick with the target that we set. But if we had a time machine and went back to, the late 1980s and early 1990s, then you would have more flexibility around what target you'd want to pick. And I think 2 is an interesting one because it does, think about 0. If you had a 0% inflation target, which some were pushing for in the late 80s, when Canada was thinking about this, that would mean that nominal interest rates would tend to be lower than at an inflation rate of 2%. Mm-hmm. And since monetary policy works by influencing short-term nominal interest rates, having a 2% inflation gives the central bank a little bit more room to lower interest rates when necessary during a recession, for example. So I think monetary policy would be more difficult at 0 than at 2. But higher rates of inflation, also come with some volatility, and it makes kind of planning as an individual, as a business, making long-term decisions more difficult. So 2 is kind of this kind of interesting, probably the right sweet spot here between low and stable inflation, but not quite 0, which would create some policy challenges.
The problem with 2 to 3% interest rates is if you compound it over, say, 100 to 200 years, that's a lot of inflation.
Yeah.
Does that worry you?
So So what worries me about inflation is volatility. Right? When prices rise dramatically in an unexpected way, or when prices fall dramatically in an unexpected way, this has the effect of really redistributing resources across individuals. So imagine you as a lender. You provide a loan to someone and you charge a certain interest rate over a certain period of time. And you do that because you, need some actual real return for the risk you're taking as a lender, but you also build in a little cushion to compensate for the inflation that you expect. And as long as the actual inflation is consistent with what you expected it to be, then your plans are not disrupted, right? And so I think that's how we should think about the negative economic implications of inflation. If everything is relatively stable and smooth and increases at 2%, then we kind of know what to expect over time. We set our prices, we set our interest rates, we set our wage demands with employers in a way that is consistent with that 2% expectation. So even over time, 2% grows and price levels will be a lot higher 100 years from now than they are today, but so too will incomes. And what's relevant for our living standard is our income compared to price levels, right? Think of it as that ratio. And as long as both the numerator and denominator of that ratio are, aligned, plus a little extra income because of productivity growth over time, then it's okay. What's really problematic is when inflation's jumping up, jumping down, up and down. That disrupts our ability to formulate long-term plans. That lowers investment, lowers economic growth.
In simple terms, code red is when inflation goes hyper, and I guess that's what wrecks societies.
Absolutely. I mean, hyperinflation is a whole different circumstance. So here we've inflation in Canada peaking at 8.1%. That does have a real implication for people's living standards, right? A dollar no longer goes as far as it used to. And so, real incomes, the amount of goods and services people can buy shrinks, and that's painful. And I don't want to take away from that, but it doesn't get at the underlying fabric of the economy and society as a whole. So when you're talking about inflation in the thousands of percent, where you're effectively wiping out the value of your currency, that collapses whole economies. It disrupts our ability to engage in the type of exchanges and trade that make an economy run. Like if you can't hold a dollar with any degree of certainty, even for the next day, without it dropping in value by half, that's, you're not going to engage in the same trade that you would have previously. And so these are situations where people will shift away from using currency to mediate their interactions. Maybe they'll use something else, maybe foreign currency. Maybe they'll barter, maybe, gold. So that's a lot more costly to engage in exchange than our kind of typical payment system that we have here. So hyperinflation is horrific for societies and economies that go through it. Luckily, we're nowhere near, it's not even on the radar at all. And that's because we have very strong monetary policy. We missed our target. Monetary policy is not easy, but we are clearly seeing that central banks are tightening in response to inflation rising. And if needed, will tighten further, right? They will not allow inflation to become the kind of incredibly problematic situation that it's in. There, you basically need a central bank to just be printing money to no end. And we can have a debate about whether monetary and fiscal policy was maybe too loose in 2020 and 2021. That's certainly an interesting debate. But no one's printing money to no end in a way that would lead us to like Zimbabwe or a 1930s Germany situation.
On the other hand, the optimistic scenario would be when the GDP is consistently growing, getting better, and the pie is growing for everybody. How does that affect the inflation and cost of everything? To look at it optimistically.
So great question. It really depends on why GDP has increased. So there is a certain productive capacity of an economy to make goods and services. So if you have more inputs, you can make more output. So population, labor force growth, that certainly matters for GDP. What the capital stock is of your economy. So if you have more machinery and equipment, then you can produce more goods and services. So your productive capacity determines what we call your potential level of output. And think about that as a long-run sustainable level of output that's not itself leading to any kind of inflationary pressures. You can temporarily exceed your potential level of output, and we say when that happens that you have entered into an inflationary gap. If you're producing more than your potential, maybe you're incurring higher costs to do so than you otherwise would. You may be running a night shift, maybe hiring lower productivity individuals. And so that tends to come with higher prices. It tends to be inflationary. How you can get sustainable GDP growth over the long term without having that kind of inflationary pressure come about is, have more inputs. Increase investment, right? So business investment matters because it affects how much machinery and equipment we have. It affects the capital stock that we're working with. Also think about increasing the labor force. It's over a smaller country like Canada. Immigration's pretty important there, but also labor force participation, getting more people involved in the labor force. So thinking about skills training programs to make sure that people are fully using their human capital. As our society ages, I think we'll start to think more about how to support older workers, in their 60s, to maybe delay retirement decisions, that sort of thing. But the most important thing by far for GDP growth long term is productivity, innovation, right? Just being able to figure out how to do more from the inputs that we have, right? This means technological innovation. It means adopting and applying technology that exists, right? And so that kind of innovation, in principle, can just go on forever.
In your opinion, what is the best way to fight inflation? Is it higher interest rates? Is it higher productivity? What is the best way?
So there's lots of things that can affect it. Basically, anything that affects prices will show up in that consumer price index. Now, boosting productivity, absolutely. No question we should do that to the extent possible. Always, just because that's the source of why our living standards are so much higher than they were in the past. So there's benefits of productivity increases independent of what their implication is for inflation in the short term. How to fight inflation is, I think, from a policy perspective, something really about fiscal and monetary policy. The central bank, the Bank of Canada, their mandate is to have inflation at 2%. And they can operate within this 1% to 3% target band. And I think that's appropriate. A central bank that is laser focused on inflation with no other target to worry about, just one single goal that they try and achieve through interest rate changes. That's the right way to go. But fiscal policy still matters, and the government should think about this when it's formulating its tax and spending decisions, because they are a large entity and their decisions can really importantly change the overall demand for goods and services, which affects prices. So fiscal policy, we saw through COVID, large increases in government spending, here and in many countries. And a lot of that was transfers to individuals and businesses, who then take that additional income and potentially increase their demand for goods and services. So there is certainly a potential link between fiscal policy expansion and the increase in inflation. That's certainly a contributing factor. Don't get me wrong, not the only factor, maybe not even the biggest, but a factor. And so dialing back a lot of that expansion in government spending was important, and we have done that. A lot of the bigger programs have already stopped, but the government, needs to think about when it formulates its spending decisions, especially at a time of high inflation, whether or not it's adding fuel to that fire. And I think, provincial governments have a role there too. It's not just the federal government. It's governments writ large that need to think about that. And that's not easy. I mean, spending money is kind of what Politicians do. And here we are in an election campaign in Alberta. It doesn't matter, whether it's a Conservative Party or a Liberal Party or the New Democratic Party. So here we just basically have the Conservatives and the NDP. Both of them have kind of aligned on increasing spending. The Conservatives through the budget this year, which I think dramatically increased spending because resource revenues were just so high through 2022. And that can have implications for inflation within the province. I don't think all that big, but it's something that that government should think about.
Does that concern you that you get a political leader that comes on board, for example, the last 2-3 years where the federal government debt has gone to record highs? Does that concern you? It just totally undermines all the work that goes into the central bank and the fiscal policies? Yeah,
great question. Well, I think important to remember where we all were as individuals, as businesses, governments in early 2020. There was a lot of big decisions made in a very rapidly changing environment, a lot of uncertainty about what COVID meant, in terms of public health for sure, but also disruptions globally. And so governments made some quick decisions. And so it's easy in retrospect to learn lessons about maybe fiscal policy having expanded too much or not enough. And then we can learn from that going forward. I don't really fault governments for making choices, in a fog of war situation, as quickly as they can. And I think public debt, one of its purposes is to act as a shock absorber to big macro events like a pandemic, but more commonly like recessions. And so as long as we're focused on returning public debt levels to relatively, like to the pre-COVID level that they were at over a reasonable span of time, then I think that's okay. So public debt rising during difficult times and then falling during good times, allowing us to kind of ride that out. The risk is that we don't lower public debt in the good times, right? If we're smoothing things over a whole cycle, that's one thing. But if we ratchet debt up in bad times and then kind of keep it at that higher level and then ratchet it up again later on when an inevitable recession occurs, that's incredibly problematic. So that's something where in Alberta, interestingly, we have brought public debt levels provincially to their pre-COVID levels. Alberta is lucky to have benefited from high oil prices, and so it was easier to do that. But under the former Premier Kenney, there was a real focus on spending restraint, and the windfall that did occur, the overwhelming majority of it was allocated to debt repayments. We have a new premier now, and so slightly different priorities, and we've shifted towards kind of ratcheting up spending levels compared to what the former premier would have. But we still have a pretty stable and manageable debt situation in the province. Federally, we kind of went into COVID with federal public debt at about 1/3 of the economy. And then COVID ratcheted that up to nearly 50%. So a big increase in federal public debt levels. We've come down slightly from those highs, but there's not really in the medium term here any kind of reasonable prospect of returning to that 33%. And so I think that, I guess I'm of two minds here. I guess on the one hand, I personally would have preferred a return to pre-COVID debt levels in a clearer, I guess, timeline. I don't know what the right timeline is, but 5 years out, bringing things down, more restraint on spending there, and personally, maybe even thinking about tax measures. Like if we want to bring debt levels down, we should think about both sides of the coin, revenue and spending. But over the longer term, the federal government is in a much better spot than provinces, and so I don't really have a really big source of concern for federal fiscal sustainability, just because their revenues tend to grow with the economy and their spending tends to grow more slowly. Provinces, meanwhile, it's the reverse. Revenues tend to lag GDP growth provincially because taxes only account for about half of provincial revenues. Spending, meanwhile, is projected to grow much more quickly because it's provinces that are exposed to health cost increases. So our aging population puts a lot of pressure on provinces that the feds largely avoid. So long term, the federal government's in a better structural position. Now, that being said, what we've seen over the past few years is the federal government moving into the fiscal space that it has. Like it's ratcheted up spending levels. It has changed policy to increase overall spending. So mechanically, if we were to just hold everything where it is now, then federal debt levels would gradually decline. But governments change policy all the time, and I think that's where I have some concern with federal fiscal policy. It seems to be unanchored, where each kind of budget that comes out, they ratchet up to a whole higher trajectory than they were on before. So I think that's where I'd have some concerns.
In theory, the Bank of Canada is supposed to be independent of the current federal party, but in reality, it's murky. The critic would say that it seems to be that they're influenced by whoever's in charge. How do you think of it that way? Does that worry you? And how do you mitigate that influence?
Yeah, good question. This is something where Canada and many countries have grappled with the right degree of independence of a central bank. And I think there's the right sweet spot where Canada is now that a lot of countries have kind of converged to, where we have a central bank that is operationally independent in terms of the day-to-day decisions that it makes, but it's not independent in terms of what its goals are. So the 2% inflation, that's not because the bank decided that's what it wants its target to be. It's because the government decided that's what its target is going to be. And the 2% specifically was Paul Martin, and successive finance ministers over time, reiterating and re-implementing that mandate. There is the ability of the federal government to issue orders to the Bank of Canada. Directives, I think they're formally called. That's where the Minister of Finance can tell the Bank of Canada to do something in terms of monetary policy choices, and the governor either does it or must resign. We've never done that before in Canada's history. If this is done, then the law is pretty clear. If it's done, it must be published in the Gazette. So it would be public if it were done. And, obviously there's going to be some information flow between the government and the bank, and the Deputy Minister of Finance does sit on, non-voting member, but sits on the council that kind of formulates monetary policy. So I don't want to say influence, but there's certainly information flow between the two. But the bank has a clear mandate of 2%. And, that's what they're laser focused on. I know that through COVID, a lot look back and view quantitative easing or the reduction in interest rates and keeping them low for so long. And they point to that as because they were somehow doing it because the government wanted them to. Or because they needed to, in order to lower debt service costs for the government to facilitate the high level of spending that we saw. I have a different view where monetary policy was eased because there was a big negative shock. And looking back, maybe it was eased too much for too long. Now, of course, that's easy to say in hindsight, and researchers will be looking back over these years for decades to come, learning lessons that we can apply in the future. So in retrospect, it's one thing to say that we made a mistake. And I think that would be fair in terms of monetary policy. It's quite another to presume that the bank was behaving in the way that it did because it was trying to achieve some partisan objective. I absolutely think there's no evidence for that, and every reason to suspect that that's not the case, because what the Bank of Canada did was pretty similar to what we saw central banks all over the world do.
These are complex systems, very complicated, very hard. A lot of the smartest people in the world work on them, yet their mistakes made, like we just talked about now. Yeah,
certainly not easy. And fundamentally, why is monetary policy hard? Well, we talked about the lag. When you make monetary policy decisions that influence interest rates, that will change behavior a year and a half, 2 years down the line, or for some activities, potentially even longer. So you have a lever that you can pull that takes a long time to have an effect. In addition to that lag, it's not fixed. It's not mechanical. That lag can be longer sometimes and shorter other times. So we say it's a long and variable lag. So imagine driving a car where the steering wheel only affects the wheel position of the vehicle with an unpredictable delay. That would be an incredibly hard vehicle to drive, right? So it's fundamentally hard in terms of the policy area that they're in. And so we shouldn't be under the impression that the Bank of Canada's job is easy. I think it's really to their great credit that for the better part of nearly 3 decades leading up to COVID, we did such a good job controlling inflation. That's a really significant accomplishment. And COVID was an incredibly difficult period of time, lots of uncertainty. I mean, March 2020, April 2020, trying to make decisions that have implications for the next year and a half, 2 years down the line, super tough. And it's only in retrospect that we can look back and say, okay, maybe we did a little bit too much. And those will be important lessons to learn for future crises. But yeah, it's hard in the moment.
Nassim Taleb would compare certain central bank ministers to soccer moms, where you're over protective of the big black box. You don't really know what the outputs are going to be. It's really hard. You don't know. It's a very complex system. Do you worry that although some of the smartest people work on these problems, that you just don't know?
Well, what's the alternative? So monetary policy exists whether we like it or not, right? Things affect the monetary system. Things affect interest rates. And we can try and influence those forces. And we do that through a central bank that can increase or decrease short-term rates because of its direct involvement in like the overnight market with banks. It can influence longer-term rates by buying and selling bonds. And so I think having an institutional structure that aims at maintaining low and stable inflation and does so using tools that over time we've become better at using, it is the right approach. And certainly we can change how it's done in the future, changing the type of monetary policy tools that we use. In recent years, since the financial crisis, lots of interesting and important debate about quantitative easing. What are the channels through which it works? What are the effects? What are some of the risks that come with it? And so we may use these tools differently in the future, no question. So it's complex. A lot of the smartest people work in these areas. Countless Nobel Prizes to economists who've been thinking about monetary policy issues for some time, and that's really the best we can do. Try and use the most rigorous, robust research and analysis to inform our policy decisions and continually strive to do better over time, but recognizing that it's not perfect and never will be.
Housing in Calgary, the local economy, things are going pretty well locally these days?
Yeah, I'd say so. And actually, Calgary is an interesting... So I don't worry that things are too strong in Calgary. I think there are some important economic challenges to think about here. We do have a higher unemployment rate, for example, than most other major cities in the country. Now, a lot of that is because we have a much larger participation rate, right? There's a larger fraction of our population in Calgary that's out there looking for work. And that tends to increase the unemployment rate just because if you're looking for work, you're counted as unemployed. But if you're not looking, you're not counted as unemployed. So part of our high unemployment rate is because of that. So that's a challenge where, you know, ensuring that people can find good matches, right? The right employers. And I guess time will tell whether or not the unemployment rate here comes down. But it's not as though there's some kind of overheating economically in the city. There's lots of available slack in the labor market. I mentioned the searching workers. There's lots of available slack in commercial real estate downtown, very high vacancy rate that we see there. And so having businesses moving into the city, it's taking up vacant space downtown. And so that's something we need more of. And we have seen very large inflows of individuals from other markets, Ontario and British Columbia, big negative net outflows of interprovincial migration. And most of that going to Alberta. And so we've seen several very strong quarters of a large number of people moving in to Calgary, to Alberta. And I think a lot of that is because the economy is doing well. There's demand for labor, but also affordability issues, right? Housing here in Calgary is affordable, right? Period. In a way that it is not in any way in Vancouver or Toronto. So younger people especially, I don't understand how someone could make a go of it in the GTA, especially anyone with kids who might need some more space. And so more people ought to be moving to Alberta, and they ought to be moving to Calgary than they are. And I think that's part of why we've seen some of the increases in net migration in recent quarters.
It's a good thing in a lot of ways, but when you zoom out, I guess over the long term, it'll stabilize. But right now it seems like housing it's going up. It's really hard to buy a house. Makes life a little bit difficult for the people that do live here. Does that worry you? How do you think of it that way? So
I guess I'm comparing us to other markets, and it's certainly not easy to purchase homes. They are more expensive in Calgary now than they were many, many years ago. But on average, it takes about 1/3 of income to be able to afford the average home in Calgary. And that's an affordable share for someone whose income is average. That's not to say there's not challenges for individuals who maybe have income levels that are below average or maybe because of family size, need to have an above average home, for example. But I think Calgary is also unique in that we have just a whole range of options. We do have communities on the outer edges in the Northwest, or a lot of new communities in the South, and affordability improves. Right there, you're trading off the financial cost for the time cost involved in commuting, and so that's still a real cost to consider. But I think we have a lot more options for individuals to consider in this city than many others do in others. So at a macro level, at a high level, yeah, I guess I don't have a lot of concerns about affordability overall, which is not to say that there's not pockets of real challenges for individuals in different circumstances. And there we need to think about maybe targeted ways of supporting individuals rather than thinking about there being a challenge for the housing market as a whole. Whereas in Toronto and Vancouver, I mean, if you earn average income, you cannot afford an average home, right? So there's a market-wide problem in those areas. It just doesn't exist in Calgary.
You may not have the answer, but why? Why is it so expensive in Toronto and Vancouver?
I don't know. And I think that's the honest answer that, most would give. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to explain why prices got as high as they did even prior to the pandemic and then jumped 40% through that period. So yeah, I don't know. Part of it is because there are supply challenges, right? The price of anything is going to be determined by supply and demand. And a lot of the attention in BC and Ontario have been around things like foreign buyers. Is that a big factor? Yeah, in principle, maybe. If you have an increase in the demand for something, then the price will go up. But I think the bigger challenge for them is that they just haven't been building. Very restrictive zoning, just completely inappropriately restrictive zoning in my mind. And so thinking about ways of expanding density is very important. And we have seen some moves there. Toronto, for example, I think it was a week or two ago, I might have my timing wrong, but changing zoning laws to allow for duplexes or fourplexes anywhere in the city. And so over time, that'll help increase the supply. And I think thinking about how to just build more long term is going to be how we can improve the situation in those markets.
On the podcast before, I've compared the Alberta economy to what perhaps it could be, say, in Texas or California, where they have tech, they have oil and gas, farming, SpaceX. In Texas, they have the ocean. Same with California, where they seem to just have everything. What to you is a healthy Alberta economy?
I think Alberta's economy is quite healthy, and we do have everything minus the ocean. Right. That would be one thing.
It is healthy, but I guess robust.
I think it's robust too. I think Alberta's economy is broadly misunderstood. We think about it as an oil and gas driven economy, but as you just noted, that's not the case. It is so much more diversity than even Albertans give it credit for. Yes. And certainly anyone outside of Alberta, they just think of it as oil and gas and that's it. It's completely false. Yes. So we're among the most diversified economies in the country along so many metrics. All these sectors and the growth that we're seeing in things like tech is really exciting. I think about Neo Financial and the huge success that it has had as a new financial technology firm. We have the second highest number of headquarter operations here in Calgary, second only to Toronto. And that's not just oil and gas, right? It's a huge presence across the board in lots of different sectors. Where oil and gas has an outsized influence on the economy is in terms of the dollars that it generates. Royalty revenues being a big one, but also corporate profits, right? So there's certainly more volatility in certain income flows. Royalties go up and down, corporate profits go up and down in a way that's tied to commodity prices, but that volatility is not something that makes our real economy more volatile. Like if you look at employment rates every economy goes through recessions, and the cause is going to be different. Alberta's recessions are not more frequent, they're not deeper, and they're not longer lasting than recessions in other economies. And so it's not as though we're boom and bust in terms of the real economic activity. Our government budget, has some, is a lot more volatile than government budgets elsewhere because royalty revenues naturally go up and down with prices, and oil prices are volatile. But that's a diversification challenge for the government and their finances, and thinking about ways of managing that better. Personally, I think we should spend more time talking about those issues than we do. I think we should be saving more of the royalties to try and cushion that ups and downs. But that's not an economic challenge. That's just a government finance challenge that matters. So Alberta's economy, I think, it has so many strengths going forward. And I think a lot of these strengths will be things that lead to even greater economic outcomes in the future. So why do I say that? Well, we talked about affordability. All right. How do you attract and retain talent as a business if your employees struggle with just having a home? Right? So employers in Toronto and Vancouver, that's a challenge for them. And that's why younger people are and should in greater numbers move to Alberta and to Calgary. And we already have the youngest population in the country, and Calgary is the youngest city here. So demographics are hugely in our favor. And that will continue to be the case. And, longer term demographics is destiny, the expression goes. That's a big point in Alberta's favor. But we're also lucky that we do, because of our resource revenues, we do have, a tax environment that's quite a bit more competitive than other jurisdictions. So that matters. And just the lifestyle that you get here as well is, I think, unparalleled. So I'm actually from Vancouver and spent the first, a little over 2 decades of my life there. And don't get me wrong, great city, fabulous city, but it rains a lot. The summer in Vancouver is great. The winter, maybe less so. Personally, that's my preferences here. But anyone who has kind of got an active lifestyle, likes the outdoors, Calgary is where it's at for sure. And so I think that's an area of strength that will continue as well.
When you looked around the city the last, 5-6 years, it's pretty intangible, but everywhere you looked, it seems like there's building. That's a pretty intangible metric, but at the same time, it kind of gets back to your point that maybe there wasn't such a big downturn in Alberta and Calgary as everybody seemed to think there was.
Yeah, so
everywhere.
It depends on where you were. Yeah, so there's a lot of building for sure, and that's to accommodate large inflows. Right, population growth rates are pretty high. A lot of that because of migration from elsewhere. But if you were someone who let's say you owned some commercial space and now it's been sitting vacant for years. So big contraction in downtown commercial property. So, and that's a challenge that we're still grappling with, today. Something where I think over time will be addressed. There's modest scope to convert some of these into residential units. That's a lot more challenging than people suspect, but there's some issues there. But gradually, as more businesses come in and take up those space, some of them are converted to residential, some are demolished, like older commercial buildings, maybe just getting rid of them, building something new in it on that plot of land. Then that'll be a problem that's gradually solved over time. But
sometimes it's easy to give prescriptions on economic policy and advice to the government and criticize people, but sometimes it's better just to, or maybe more constructive, to provide heuristics or rules of thumb. If you were to give advice to the current people in charge in terms of fiscal and economic policy, what heuristics would you offer them?
So in Alberta, so I guess where I'll focus my answer on is clear to me the biggest fiscal challenge we face is how we manage resource revenues. They're very volatile. They go up and they go down. And when they go up, what we tend to do is spend the excess dollars. So if we look at resource revenues grew by an unexpected $12 billion. So in effect, we had a windfall and we spent most of it. And we don't do the same thing in reverse. Like when resource revenues fall, it's much more difficult to contract spending quickly. And so we have this asymmetry in Alberta where volatility in resource revenues leads us to ratchet up spending levels. And so I think we need to do a much better job managing that. And so a heuristic, simple rule of thumb would be to not view resource revenues in the same way that we view other income. This is really about converting a physical asset that we own, oil, into a financial asset, dollars, royalties. And so not viewing it as income, not viewing it as something that should be available just for normal spending could improve things in the province a lot. And that would, I think, change our mindset. Like it's a balance sheet transaction, not a revenue flow to the province. So changing how we think about resource revenues, viewing them not as income, but as just converting some of our wealth from physical to financial form. And that I think would lead us to save more of it if we thought about it that way.
Save money for a rainy day.
No, save money to accumulate a permanent fund that would just generate in perpetuity investment income. Like that dollar in royalties invested earns, say, I don't know, historically, the Heritage Fund earns nearly 10% a year.
That's pretty good.
It's quite good. Yeah. And maybe too good over the long term, but I don't know, 6-7%. That means you could take oil today, save all of its value, and if properly managed, that fund would kick out investment income forever. Whereas long term, the value of oil and gas, there's lots of uncertainty about what its value will be decades down the line. Energy transitions, I don't know what the right timeline is, but over some horizon, we're going to switch to other energy sources, and that'll mean that oil is less valuable. Mm-hmm. But if we were to convert it into a financial asset, that value would last forever. So every dollar that's not saved is a missed opportunity in the province.
Comparison would be this Norway sovereign wealth fund.
Precisely.
Massive.
Precisely. Yeah. I don't know how big it is, but it is well over $1 trillion now. Now, of course, Alberta's not Norway and people don't like that. Some people don't like that comparison, but we can absolutely save more if we wanted to. And we wouldn't get to the scale of Norway. But we could get very, very large in the Heritage Fund if we were to save resource revenues more aggressively. Yeah. If we were to have saved every single dollar of resource revenues from 1976, when the fund was created, all the way through to today, I haven't done this calculation recently, but something on the order of about $500 billion. That's massive. And it's smaller than Norway. So I'm just noting that there's a scale difference, but the actual Heritage Fund here is 20-something billion. So it's a huge missed opportunity. Lots of investment income that we could have been earning.
In summary, save money, pay down debt.
Yep. And between those two, interest on government debt is sometimes less than what we would expect the returns on the Heritage Fund to be. So sometimes it may make sense to pay down debt. Sometimes it might make sense to save the money instead. But one of those two things are what we should be doing with resource revenues, especially when they come in unexpectedly high.
Intellectual humility. How do you account for the fact that although you are PhD in economics, you may be wrong, and there's a lot of complex systems like we were saying that you work on, and how do you make sure that you account for that?
Yeah, great question. I think something where not just myself, but all of us should keep in mind that there's always areas where we each know quite a bit about. Like everyone has expertise in something. We tend to specialize in a certain occupation or in a certain sector or in a certain geographic location, and we excel in that one thing. But most of us don't know much about almost anything else. We're lucky to have Google at our fingertips and can learn on the fly when things come up, but most of us know a lot about something very, very narrow and specific and particular to our lives and circumstances. And then everything else is just, we're ignorant of, me, everyone. is like that. And so just remembering that, for most things, most of the time, we don't actually know a lot about those topics. And even in the areas where you do have real expertise, the world throws curveballs, right? There's lots of uncertainty and the future may change things in a way that make what you thought was the case no longer apply. And you can also be mistaken in terms of analysis and data. And so this is where I think maybe where I can speak to my own experience. I mean, research is contingent on the methods that we use and the inputs that we have, the data that we have at our disposal. And there's a lot of sometimes fundamental shortcomings to both methods and data, right? Maybe we're not collecting data in the right way. Maybe the data is mistaken. Even StatsCan does a great job at sometimes, it needs to revise data. Sometimes maybe it's measuring things in the wrong way and it changes. Maybe the methods that we're using, like the empirical or statistical methods, lead to one result, but a different method would have led to another. So always keep in mind that no matter what the research is and the findings that you have, a future researcher may upend your conclusions. And I think that's kind of what makes academics and the scientific enterprise more broadly, a really exciting field. I mean, we're always kind of looking back at what research was done in the past, trying to identify holes and building upon that and improving. And that as a society is how we move forward. So just always as an individual, keep in mind that your results might very well not pan out in the future. And I think that's okay. So it's okay to be ignorant of almost everything. And that's, I think, is a fair summary of most of us, most of the time. And it's completely fair to be corrected by future analysis. All right. Our goal should be to just continually strive to do better. And at any given moment, recognize that we're very far from, perfect knowledge in almost any aspect of life.
Well, we don't have all day. I know you're busy. That covers a good sampling of the waterfront.
Perfect.
Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great conversation. Thanks for having me on.
People can find you on Twitter.
That's right. I'm at Trevor Tombe, Tombe.
Awesome. Thanks for listening, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed the episode. If you liked what you heard, check out rosebros.ca, where we will have upcoming shows. Until next time, happy coffee drinking.